Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all right and hope you can hear me. You know, the usual paranoia. I think that you can't hear me. I think the signal's terrible already. And so I end up talking like this for the first few minutes until you tell me everything's okay in the comments because I'm just that needy. Hope you had a good weekend and hope you're ready for some more chewing it over. Really interested in this topic today. And it was inspired by Martin Billings, a man who I've not met yet, but someone I've interacted with online over the years. I consider him and his Twitter account to be one of my favorite sort of jobbing clinician accounts that really reflects on the trials and tribulations of MSK practice. I put him in a similar category to people like Liz Jen, Adam Dobson, Ellie Tipney. I just think they're just fascinating and interesting people who are bravely willing to share all the U's and R's of MSK practice, and they've informed me and my instincts over many years. So Martin, as he often does, asked the question of social media, which I imagine, and maybe he'll be able to tell us if he's tuning in. I'm sorry, it's short notice. Such short notice, I couldn't get him on the show. Maybe, Martin, if you can join me at a later date to talk this through, it'd be great to know what's underneath your question, because there may well be some infrastructure things that he's changing. But the question that he asked, I haven't got the tweet in front of me, but he's basically asking us to what protected learning time you have for CPD, and he was asking maybe what percentage that might be, I think, or that was one of the answers that came, because it's something we'd given a lot of thought to and was part of the MSK Reform Manifesto. For those that don't know, MSK Reform is our think tank. It's a non-profit which is designed to reform MSK practice, as the name describes it. And as part of the Manifesto for Reform that was published last year, we actually made that one of our policies would be to try and get actually encoded into working contracts at least 5% protected learning time, which is actually half of that of what GPs are afforded within their contracts. And so as part of their standard contract, of course, if each individual one in practice could vary, but in terms of what you get as part of the GP's Royal College is actually part of their standard contract is actually 10% of pro rata hours. So I want to talk to you today about that. And as ever, I'd like to start with a question, which can be Martin's, in that, what do you currently have? But also what I wanted to ask you is a bit above that, and I'll explain why I think that there's something that helps us, we'll call it philosophically if you want, but what's a prior to that is, whose responsibility is it to stay up to date, which is what CPD would be, or to educate yourself alongside the actual job in work that you're doing. And we'll talk about formats of it, we'll talk about quality control, etc. But the question I want to ask you guys is, whose responsibility is it? And I know full well you're not going to give me an answer that is one person or one stakeholder group or category, but it's like, what is your take on who is primarily responsible? Is it the individual clinician? Is it the institution of which they work? Is it the governing bodies of which then mandate those sorts of things? Is it the regulators that might then be responsible if they're going to be asking for that as a standard? Is it that it should be up to them to influence how that is done? Is it something that should always be done in someone's own time? Is it that it should only be done in work time, like as part of a work to rule order? I don't know. I've got my opinions, of course, as ever, and I've given a lot of thought to this as part of the MSKR team, especially within the team of associate directors. We gave this a lot of thought, but I want to know your take before I go off on one about that, especially those that are tuning in live, but even after the fact. What are your thoughts on it? Who's responsible for that? And also, what's your current, I want you to help Martin with his question. What is people's current time that they afford to CPD, and is it protected by employers? So yeah, thanks for tuning in. And it sounds like the comments I'm getting are suggesting that the sound is fine, etc., which is good, and the network seems stable. So let me give you a few takes on the matter from me. One thing I end up talking about with this, and why MSKR was sort of coined under the 3 R's originally, which were reasoning, responsibility, and reform, was the responsibility piece ends up being where my bias is, admittedly, across the board, whereby I see a distributed responsibility model across most things. Responsibility, another word for it, sometimes being blame if something goes awry, sorry. And so responsibility, distributed responsibility to me means that there are links in a chain for that. So CPD and say staying up to date with current practice, be that evidence of all different flavors, but also just having an opportunity to learn, not just experientially by doing, but also by being able to absorb, say, CPD materials, be that in any format, written, audio, through podcasting, watching something like this, if you consider it CPD, but just generally speaking, being able to sort of think in the direction of reading, say, journal articles, whatever it might be, going on courses, conferences. I see that as being something that is a responsibility that is quite declared to individuals. You know, it's something that we sign a register as professionals. Most, you know, MSK professions have this, where you sign a register in which you're declaring yourself to a certain amount of remaining up to date. And let's not forget that the heart of that is by staying current for safety and quality grounds for the best interests of patients of which we're trying to care for and aspire to help them recover. And so it is important and imperative that we sort of stay up to date and to move past some archaic and dogmas and things like that otherwise, if you weren't to make progress post-registration, then that's a concern. And so instead, you sign a register against that. In the physio's case, it's the HCPC. And so there is a responsibility that is inherent to the individual clinician. That's the first point. But then it doesn't take much for you to realize that if that clinician is expected to do that only in their own time, therefore unpaid, and that one of the beneficiaries of them doing so is their employer, for various reasons, through service improvement as well as then efficiencies, then that's something that feels inherently unfair. And so there is an argument then that the bare minimum would be done, and understandably so, if it's not something that is accounted for or appropriately integrated within someone's service spec or where they work. So there is an employer's responsibility to some extent to afford some time for CPD or opportunity to at least think between patients or what have you, or to have these opportunities to learn whilst currently being paid for it, for want of a better term, but also just being able to integrate it within the day job. Now, should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that is something that, defined narrowly as a responsibility, is probably missing some of the really interesting points of it, because the employer might feel like they can afford the time and nothing else, but the benefits are far beyond the responsibility piece. You know, it's something that is inherently, to my eye, a really sensible thing for them to do, and for service managers to do, is that by integrating someone's CPD or providing structures, projects, direction to their CPD and learning, that's going to be of a larger net benefit to that service or department, and therefore the patients of which you serve. And the context specificity and even some of the local cultural variables that we talked about with Jackie last week, for example, that's the way that you lace that learning in to the day job, and therefore to the department, to the service, to the trust, you know, to that community. To me, it just makes sense to integrate those things. And so we're looking at these levels and thinking that individual clinician, you've then got your service of which that person might be employed, have got some responsibilities. In this case, and this is what Martin was speaking to, is to afford, at the very least, seem to afford the time for that to be integrated within their. It's a prerequisite of their job, and this is what we're going to come to in terms of why it's something that some unscrupulous managers and employers, I imagine, will try to hold their hands off their responsibilities here, apart from for things basic, low-hanging fruit like mandatory training, etc., and think that, well, it's up to us. You know, we can add it as a perk, and if people vote with their feet and they don't like the fact that we don't have those perks to pay for study leave and whatever, pay for courses and study leave, etc., then so be it. They might vote with their feet and move elsewhere, but we're not responsible for it. That's a perk. The bit that they overlook is that often in their working contracts, there is an imperative to stay up to date and to be measured against evidence. Now, admittedly, at a governance level, that is often a paper exercise, and I'll get into that, where let's imagine just on an NHS level, right, you've got these knowledge and skills framework gateways. It might not even still be called that, but essentially you've got these sort of progressing through pay scales on milestones. Say you're within a pay band, then typically, if done properly, you're meant to be appraised against those things. And you'll notice that throughout it, it's about staying up to date, demonstrating progress, moving with both evidence and in this case, evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence local to that service, and it's seen that done properly, you'd be appraised against progress. So your pay is predicated on that learning. And it's clear from when you look at those things that it's not suggesting that that's just going to emerge through time, mileage, just seeing patients. Because you need to be afforded time to actually do some of the other things, and even there's some levels in which you're sort of expected to then comply with certain things like audit skills, etc. And so you think about that, and think about if your employer is supposedly then paying you against progress, but then not affording you the sort of time and opportunity to progress. And that's why I'm describing it as a responsibility. It's not just me sort of inferring that. It's something that when I've given a thought to it, that seems central to it. So you then just at that level, I don't think it stops there. I think there's a responsibility then for when it's done, it's something that done and people are aspiring to be better clinicians. It's rewarding in many ways for patients, for services, for efficiency, for that clinician, of course, then can better themselves. I think ethically it's good to aspire to better yourself. However, there's also then, I think, a responsibility for, say, professional bodies and or regulators in this instance to then try to raise standards uniformly across, say, professions or industries, if we think about the wider MSK front, whereby then to be respected and for that style of healthcare and rehabilitation-centered healthcare that I promote to be more robust, to decrease the unwarranted variation by education, and then to raise standards in a way that society then associates us more strongly with sensible and progressive progressive care delivery, right? And they sort of aspire to the model of which we're talking about. And you think about, again, I'm speaking in sort of nebulous terms here in terms of raising standards, but it's like the regulators and professional bodies stand to gain. And also, if they are expecting not just safety standards, but then also quality standards with regards to evidence-based progress, then they're not the ones that can necessarily mandate it, but they're the ones that could really have a responsibility for influencing that as an expectation for employers, for also for their registrants and members and clinicians, is that, again, that responsibility for them to sort of lay out some rules and regulations, not that's the wrong term, isn't it? Standards of which to aspire to, even if it's soft power, even if it's not something that they've got the clout to actually mandate, then that, for me, I think there's a responsibility both ethically and practically for them to do that. And also for membership bodies, it's up to the members in them to then say that this is what we want in order to assist our conversation. So if, say, Martin's taking this up as part of a service development and service spec development, then for him to have those sorts of things to lean on, I think would be valuable for the reasons I've just mentioned. And then you can go beyond that, of course, as to why, as a society, we might want to aspire to that, to have a professional class in this direction, aspiring to quality improvement that is accounted for in their job roles, in order for them to not be needing to spend what saddles like me do, which is sort of 10 to 20 hours a week, aspiring in that direction across my career outside of work time, because there are other net benefits to what I could be doing societally and socially, and getting a better work-life balance if I wasn't having to always do that outside of my own time. And then there's always people that, like me, infovores, that are going to do more. But generally speaking, if it was more accounted for in the day job, then you're going to be less likely to be prone to burnout, etc. Arguably, and there's some evidence for that. That the integrating and getting a better separation in work and life, even though it's sort of a passion project for me and many, there is argument then socially in such a way that might influence politics and be a responsibility for what sort of society we want to create. And obviously I'm getting a bit more vague now, but that distribution of responsibility for me is important. Now, when we've then reflected on these variables as people within MSKR, when we were building the manifesto for reform, for example, it's exciting. We've got an MSKR meeting tonight with the associate directors, and we've had a little bit of a lull for various reasons, and so it's quite cool to be sort of re-incentivizing some of our priority policies, etc. But so I've been thinking in this direction, putting a presentation together for tonight. And one of the things that I remember us thinking about on this is that what is the appropriate level? And MSKR as a policy says that a minimum of 5% of your pro rata working hours should be protected for CPD. And then there are several organisations that have then been taking us up on that. I mean, soft power. It's a think tank that can float policy, and people can say no, thank you. Interestingly, we've had some when we've challenged a few organisations on, would you get on board with this? We've tested market research, tested those policies against various different organisations. I recall, for example, the CSP felt it was something that they wouldn't get on board with, and their rationale was that if there was an organisation out there, they weren't able to provide who, but if there was an organisation out there giving more than 5%, then that would actually, if say there's an organisation giving 10%, they would read that policy and therefore adjust it to the lowest common denominator because we were advocating for it. We were making the case that across the board, it's certainly not something that's job contracted at 5%, even amongst departments, etc., that are offering 5% plus. It's not something that's then typically protected in a job contract sort of way. And so we were in a situation where we felt that would be offering a suggested raise of that time and making the argument for that protected time. And unfortunately, yeah, they were, it was something that, I'm not going to even pretend that I can think that that's even close to a decent argument. But admittedly, that was one of the things that we heard from them on, and I can understand that if I was to give it some, give it the time of day as an argument, then I can think that there is precedent on a union level that you'd then make sure that you weren't clumsy enough with your language to then potentially, because you're trying to raise one thing, you don't get people bringing it down. You classically, you think about that with sort of equality-based wage activism. There's this argument that if you try and set a standard within an industry to try and raise a wage level up on a particular skill set, then there are unscrupulous employers that may then look at people that were a few quid over that and then bring them down as a way of marrying and balancing the books. For me, that's a foreign argument to what we're describing with protected learning time amongst the professional class, especially in the NHS, for example, which would be a big breakthrough. For me, I'm not going to pretend I can give that argument much time of day, and we didn't get engaged on it very thoroughly. But it's just one thing, just to account for the fact that we're, as a think tank, promoting that thoughtfully, and have heard some people moving that forward as employers and practices and services. And then, yeah, admittedly, it's something that hasn't then had a massive sort of fanfare across other organisations because there are contentions there. And as I say, it's been short-lived engagement on that. But it's just the sort of thing I thought I'd share with you as to why you may have heard a lack of fanfare around that. There isn't a unified agreement with even something like that, which is interesting. So I'm interested in the chat function. I'm just opening it back up. Sorry, I closed that off just so that I can then clear my head and not get too distracted. But let's have a little look at some of the comments that are coming in. Matthew Wyatt has said that clinicians accountable, employers responsible, and regulators check compliance. Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it, and probably a little bit briefer than I just did, going off on one for 10 minutes. So thank you for that, Matthew. Lucy Cocker, hi Lucy. She said CPD is a requirement for HCPC registration. I do feel organisations should support, but there is a balance with individuals also taking responsibility for their own learning. Absolutely, Lucy. Yeah, and thanks for tuning in. And I hope you can understand that completely overlaps with the agreement and of what I was saying, where I do see that fundamentally on a measurability level, you are in a situation where you're signing a register and, to be honestly, aspiring to make progress, and then the responsibility admittedly ends up sort of lying in the individual, but it's unfair for it to only be there, which is why I think we end up with these more interesting questions about what could be protected in job contracts and what we could aspire to as a professional class. Sam, I'm going to mispronounce your surname here. Sorry, Sam. Sam Borgwine? Yeah, probably. How do we incentivize anything that isn't patient contact time when MSK contracts don't support it? How do incentivize anything that isn't patient contact time when MSK contracts don't support it? Yeah, I mean, that's a topic in itself, Sam, and we can talk about that on another show, really. But I would say in this instance, it's very narrow-minded to infer that it's going to be an efficient service that's just got a number of therapists that then see a number of patients, and anything outside of that is waste. That's actually, we can present you and get in touch if you want. We've got some great evidence to the effect that that's not how you efficiently run a service. Not least, let's just imagine that happening over a period of time, the inevitable burnout that occurs in that instance, the absenteeism and then nominal presenteeism of inefficiency of those that are present means that that does not pay any dividends outside of very narrow tested few weeks in a sample. So I can understand what you're meaning on an empirical level, but we're dealing with humans on both sides of this, both in terms of patients as well as then therapists, as well as then managers. So humans all over the place that aren't then machines that would then make that argument come good. Now, I doubt, maybe you are, Sam, maybe you're making that case and you feel like actually that's the right thing. But we can talk about that. I'd love to get into that another time. But as a general rule, both in terms of what the data suggests as well as what is sensible employment theory, for want of a better term, is that the way in which your contracts are measured, and sometimes you do need to go to commissioners and say, I don't know if you're expecting to these people to be robots or what have you, and sometimes these KPIs and what the other things, service level agreements and numbers are associated to that are clumsily made in such a way that they are expecting that unit of output per unit of employee. But yeah, generally speaking, that's definitely short-sighted and something that we make the argument by demonstrating both in terms of the data as well as the, I don't know, I guess I'm overusing the term, but it's a philosophical argument around what it is you're trying to achieve, the output and the quality that you would get, especially over a drawn-out period of time. You would get a poor quality output from that sort of behavior where you're just trying to put cogs in a machine. Anna Maria Mazzieri. For therapists under contract, it's much easier to apply protected CPD time. How could we translate across the principle over to private practice? Shall we put it as KPI? I think in private practice terms, I think the same sort of things I was just talking about then in answer to Sam is that, fundamentally that occurs across the board, really, public and private and charity sectors, independent sectors, is that I think done properly with the right balance, then you're actually getting a quality and quantity output that is more efficient. And you can test that, you can measure that, is that by protecting a certain period of time, then you're going to have this, at least in the short term, you would immediately see that that is time that they would otherwise be able to see patients. Yeah, that's obvious. I'm not disagreeing with that as a factual reality. But the way in which that would then fit into sense of reward, sense of camaraderie, the way in which you got then more interaction between teams, you've got then service improvements, which would help efficiencies, producing resources and handouts that can help with self-management, that might alter in a positive way the referral rates in every which way. For me, that bleeds into private practice in a great way, and the way in which that is also going to help with retention. The inefficiencies that come from recruitment across sectors right now is fascinating. And so you think about the way in which that might better incentivize and create a community amongst your practice, regardless again of sector. I think it's actually really low hanging fruit, I would say. But I mean, I am a digital educator and someone that thinks in this direction a lot. And so my bias is that given the right opportunity to learn on the job and see that translated and see it not being detached, not being someone that's learning something and then practicing another thing that doesn't feel well integrated, or people, it's a bit of a cliche now, I'd say, even in business or in sort of leadership circles, but trying to get people to strive to a sense of purpose is sort of what we know, the Power of Why being the classic book in that direction. But there's plenty of work that's been done in that sense, that if you've got someone that's working under as close to their sense of personal purpose as possible, then you're going to get a much more efficient and happy worker. I think that your numbers then come. You've got the quality brings the quantity, given the right appropriate time frame. So that's where I see it, and I think it's independent of sector. Paula has said inequality of protected time within healthcare. She's then put a hyphen. I don't know if she's like leaving me in suspense there as to whether there's more to come, but there is. I agree, Paula. There's an inequality of protected time within healthcare across professions, as well as a few other things. But I definitely would I would say in this instance that how we push back against that is a fascinating one, and one that obviously we're in the thick of the fight with as MSKR. Been a funny year. You'd have heard more of us, especially on the ground, and I think that's one of the things for us to reflect on. I will share that publicly now and beyond. Really, is that the big plan that we had for 2020 as MSKR was so face-to-face heavy, it's untrue, which is a shame, because we could easily have I wish I'd have had a more balance. In hindsight, if I'd anticipated the pandemic, you'd definitely be it'd have been more balanced in terms of how it's communicated. But we had this sort of road show that was planned. We also had several events that we were going to spend money having either stands or a presence at, or events after in the evenings in the pubs of the local conferences and stuff. So we had this really big ground game. And so let's imagine this policy, which one of the prioritized ones within the governance chapter, I think. Well, it might have been in excellence, sorry. But those sorts of elements we would have been making a big song and dance about, and it's been harder for us to cut through that. But never fear, we have many plans up our sleeves, especially as we get back to some level of both new and old normal. Then you'll be hearing more about from us in that direction, and we've got some tricks up our sleeve there. But as a general rule, how we advocate for it is something that is complex. You know, it's something you've got to make a persuasive case in order for it to not completely compromise the business models of individual services or practices. You know, if you're too clumsy with that and you just be a fist shaking activist that's then just inferring that that should be, CPD is a human right. How dare you? Overnight I want 10%, never mind 5%. I want time protected. You're able to do that if you're then saying, here's my individual demands, and therefore if I don't get that, I'll walk. Then they're in a situation where, of course, that's how you can vote with your feet and move elsewhere with your employment, right? You're selling your labor. But in terms of the way in which it might be more maturely negotiated, is that you're then in a situation where you demonstrate the benefits across the different stakeholder groups. And that's the layers to that responsibility that I was talking about. But not just the responsibility, but the net gains. The gains actually increase, I think, the individual gains, an individual person. And then I think you've got then this layered approach. I think you actually benefit. The service benefits from the net gains, and then the trust, and then the beyond. And I'd even say, as far as to say that we're getting measured by, say, regulators and professional bodies in a more accurate fashion, and they benefit from the fact that you've got this uniform raising of standards and appropriate self-regulation that's occurring. Think about the silo. One of the problems we've got at the moment is like siloed working. If you bring that together and create these even independent private practices are going to need to start linking more and to create more camaraderie in local communities in such a way that then you've got this sense that the tide rises all ships. So I think the benefits actually scale up as you go up that responsibility curve in terms of groups beyond the individual. Lucy Cocker. Hi, Lucy. She then said, have you had any commissioner responses to 5% protected time? Yeah, we had commissioner consults within the actual development of the manifesto. They were supportive of it, but again, they were sort of suggesting that you need to make sure that their big thing was that it needs to not be a clumsy thing that's then just inferred as being a subjective good for the individual clinicians, that yes, they'd rather see a few less patients and read a few books, and as if it would be like stuff that they're having to do in their own time that they'd bring into work, and that there wouldn't be an obvious measurable gain. And so they were saying that with the appropriate facts and figures and efficiency outputs that you'd then need to measure, then they were into it, and they could understand the fact that any commissioners are they're bothered about those sort of numbers and bean counting and stuff. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that, but they're also, when we've spoken to them, especially since we had some commissioners, I think, came to Parliament when we launched the manifesto as well. And I spoke to one of them, and I can't pretend, therefore, that this is representative, massive sample bias there. But I remember speaking to him, and she was saying, they really are bothered about the fact that there's such variation across postcodes and cross services and stuff, and even cross clinician. So it's that, the individual flair of clinicians and how they deliver care, they're not bothered about. But the fact that there's such an overwhelming difference between someone referred for back pain to one person to another, they understand that one of the few things that can really do that is to make a hearts and minds persuasive case on what it means to be a clinically excellent MSK physio. And education surely is a key part of that, and therefore it needs to be found in time, because you can't rely on that in people's own time, because that disparity only accentuates. Again, I'm not saying that's every commissioner, maybe some are more short-sighted than that, but as a general rule, we've had a fairly good response, as long as it's done the right way, as long as it's not just, again, it's like a childish fist shake, which is sometimes how things are seen if it's not well articulated. And as I say, I think we're well articulated in the manifesto. over the 12 months that have then since then, I'm not going to pretend that we've articulated it nearly as well socially as we'd like for various reasons. You can imagine the pandemic's thrown us all off as you can think. So, but we'll be back on that train. Don't you worry. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for those that have tuned in with the comments and please do let me know if you're tuning into this after the fact, or if you've got any further thoughts on this, then do let me know. We can touch this another time, another shows, and Sam's points is a really good one as to incentivizing counterintuitive variables within service development. That's one of the things, and maybe I'd love to get my good friend and mentor Paula Deacon on to talk about that, because she's just a wonderful person in that direction, someone who's done the doing there, and so maybe we could get her on the show at some point to talk about that, because she's far more experience and actual expertise in that direction than me. But anyway, thanks a lot, really appreciate it as ever, and I will see you tomorrow. And if I remember where my buttons are, goodbye from me.